My father was opposed to my mother's pursuit of employment, a decision I initially found perplexing. However, with the passage of time, I came to recognize a remarkable coincidence: my wife and I both commenced work at the same company. This arrangement seemed ideal, as it allowed us to interact on a daily basis. Nevertheless, I soon realized that my optimism was misguided. The inexpensive binoculars I had purchased had a detrimental impact on my vision. This realization dawned on me last June, marking the end of my previous way of life. I am Daniel, or Dan to my friends. I am 5 feet 10 inches tall, weigh 80 pounds, have dark brown hair, and some have described my eyes as piercing brown. I work for one of the government agencies responsible for preserving the rights and liberties of American citizens. I am not at liberty to disclose which agency I work for, as it would compromise national security. I was positioned between two crumbling buildings in a rundown Washington neighborhood, observing two individuals. I was sufficiently familiar with the gangster jargon to understand that I was watching a woman enjoying a man through binoculars. This was nearly the cause of my insanity. Two factors contributed to the imminent occurrence of this event. Primarily, the individuals in question were assumed to be fellow agents engaged in surveillance. Secondly, the woman in view was my wife. I procured an inexpensive pair of binoculars and observed the scene. Despite the distress I was causing, I found myself unable to avert my gaze. I was overcome with anger. I have just departed from the scene that marked the conclusion of my unexpected visit to the woman I believed to be my romantic partner. She was occupied with her work at the time. I observed more than sufficient evidence to last a lifetime. I referred to Meg as the Meg, as that is her precise name, was unfaithful to me. Due to agency regulations, we never collaborated on operations. Even if we could access mission logs or boards to learn about each other's whereabouts or activities, we usually avoided doing so. Emotions often impede judgment in the field. Consequently, we avoided letting them know. I must admit that seeing Meg in danger would have previously prompted me to push her to retire or switch to a in the field. I believe the primary distinction between me and a civilian in this circumstance is in the realm of emotional experience, where there is likely no difference. However, there are significant disparities in my ability to compartmentalize emotions and carefully organize my answers. Furthermore, there are significant disparities in my ability to compartmentalize emotions and carefully organize my answers. The resources and strategies for seeking revenge are analogous to the vast distances traversed by light in a vacuum. I retreated discreetly from the scene, maintaining a veneer of composure that belied the anguish within. Observers might have misinterpreted my slightly perplexed demeanor as perplexity over the route to my vehicle. In truth, one or more individuals were on the brink of serious injury or even death. Ree's expertise with his instrument was a source of immense gratification. I leaned back in my chair, my thoughts turning to my husband Dan. My decision to pursue a career in the agency industry was largely influenced by him. I hold him in high regard, more so than he could ever express. My role as an agent for a government organization is a field I find both challenging and rewarding. The name of the agency eludes me, but my duties require undivided attention. Distractions can be perilous, and the imminent danger that surrounds me and my partner is almost tangible as adrenaline courses through my veins, warning me that every instant could be my last. Approximately a year ago, following a significant misstep on a mission, my boyfriend took prompt action, bringing me into an abandoned structure to resolve the issue. We then engaged in physical intimacy, after which he returned to our assignment. The meeting, which created an adrenaline rush, resulted in outstanding performance throughout the operation. When I got home, I expressed my feelings. My pent-up need for Dan, and the fatigue that accompanied it, were both factors in my decision to remain silent about the underlying reason for enhancing my productivity. Instead, many attributed it to an adrenaline rush and work-related stress. A few months later, my colleague Josie requested a transfer, and I was allocated a new partner. I was reluctant to upset in the existing setting. I consulted with Josie to ensure that I had all the resources I needed. We did not have direct contact, as I would not have allowed it, given that it would have entailed cheating on Dan, which I was not willing to do. However, handwork, which satisfied two people, seemed an acceptable compromise. Furthermore, there is an unspoken understanding among intelligence and law. It is the responsibility of the enforcement services to ensure that all activities conducted during operations are kept confidential. I assumed that Dan would understand this. I also hoped that my current companion, would outlast my previous 4 partners over the past year. However, I have recently experienced a sense of unease. I gently lifted Ree's head away from me and looked around. Ree then exclaimed. I observed him leap to his feet and reach for his firearm, though I restrained myself from laughing. I was aware of the gravity of the situation and inquired as to how we would account for the subject of our surveillance evading capture while we were on duty. It would have been prudent for us to maintain a higher level of vigilance or at the very least be able to request assistance. We were tasked with monitoring the subject. Ree's displeasure was evident. I responded, irritated, as I had been while you were preoccupied. If we can resolve this issue, I will request a new partner. Ree summoned the mobile unit, attempting to shift responsibility for failing to intercept the fleeing subject onto them. We returned to the base in solitude, having packed our equipment. Our automobile was silent and had a gloomy vibe. I went down to the underground parking lot to get my own car for the ride home and saw Ree, who was waiting for me. Prior to our collaboration, I was highly satisfied with my job. Ree stated that he has been experiencing feelings of distress on a regular basis. He proceeded to reveal that he has been grappling with challenges related to intimacy. Prior to our encounter, I had heard anecdotes about you, but I did not perceive it as a matter of my concern. However, following our interaction, I came to understand the veracity of these accounts. Initially, I was astonished. I mean, you possess a remarkable degree of physical attractiveness. He commented, smiling, I keep dreaming that eventually I'll have the opportunity to meet you. He then proceeded to describe the type of person one would want as a friend. Every time I see Dan, I feel awful as if I have betrayed his confidence, he admitted. He felt compelled to inform him that he is married to an unfaithful woman and seek forgiveness. He added that as soon as this operation is over, we will be finished. He concluded seriously, I cannot afford another mistake like today's, which will jeopardize the security of my country, my marriage, my career, or my life. Upon returning home, I was unable to respond before the house was rendered entirely dark and silent. After disabling and reactivating the security system in the kitchen, I discerned that Dan had not prepared dinner, which suggested his fatigue. Upon his return, he presumably retired to bed, anticipating an early work call. This was a deviation from his typical conduct while I was undergoing surgery. Typically, he would contact me at regular intervals, but at work, I would disable my phone to prevent disruption. I was therefore surprised to find that he had not reached out this time. After checking my phone, I observed that he had contacted me virtually every hour until approximately 8, the time was 12 a.m. It was probable that he was already resting in bed and preparing for his morning commute. It was unusual that he did not wait for my return. He typically waited until I arrived home safely. Our customary intimacy did not appear to exist. Nevertheless, my feelings for him remained strong. I proceeded to our bedroom and turned on the lights, aware Dan's light slumber. I anticipated that he would move, but he remained unperturbed. I planned to speak with him in the morning to determine what to tell him and to what extent I could rely on his support. I fell asleep. I heard Meg enter, but I pretended to sleep. I was reluctant to engage in further intimacy with her the following morning. The following morning, I arose at an early hour and proceeded to our workstation, navigating the numerous security protocols. I procured a coffee and joined my division chief. Annie, I inquired, what are your plans for today? You're still responsible for monitoring those advertisements, I interjected. Ari, I prefer not to be kept apprised of her employment-related concerns. It is important to maintain a clear separation between one's professional and personal lives. However, this is a unique situation. He countered that neither she nor Ree reported that their suspect had vacated the premises more than 8 minutes after he left. He further explained that when the suspect failed to show, the mobile unit that had been requested was already stationed at the only access road to the residence in question. The team demanded the use of a helicopter, which was subsequently deployed. The subject's vehicle roof had been coated with an invisible reflecting polymer, which enabled the helicopter to locate him with remarkable speed and precision, despite his distance from the aircraft, which was at least 5 kilometers away. It is therefore necessary to ascertain how the subject was able to evade detection. He stated that unexpected events are not uncommon in his field, and I offered my understanding. Indeed, the deployment of 2 agents for basic surveillance is a standard procedure. If one agent is unable to continue, the other can maintain surveillance and monitor any developments. It can be concluded that the same methodology has been employed, with the advertisement being run on the subject's own initiative. However, when the subject makes a move, the observer is quick to act. It was noted that there were 2 individuals monitoring the subject, and that the subject simply got into his vehicle and drove away. It was observed that the subject had recently engaged in a driving excursion, which raises the question of whether the vehicle had been cleaned. From the helicopter, I was unable to identify him. He reflected, "After this operation, I have some serious questions for your wife and her partner." He added, "To maintain appearances, I'm sending them back out there, assuring them that no harm has been done." He continued, "If they mess up again, I'll have to drop the act and become Dr. Shitty." He spoke with a firm tone, indicating that he was aware of the separation between work and home but encouraged her to mature. I was tasked with tracking down an arms dealer from a gang suspected of obtaining weapons via contacts in our military, while simultaneously losing a firearm. Such occurrences were not uncommon. Due to the aforementioned circumstances, these men were responsible for the delivery of significant quantities of weaponry to unscrupulous actors across the globe. As part of my standard procedure, I typically record my surveillance sessions for the purpose of identifying and rectifying any errors that may arise. My field operators are unable to communicate directly with me, which means that they can hear me but I cannot hear them. This prevents unintended exposure during undercover operations. When I use special code words, they know to intervene immediately. I note that Meg and her partner were assigned to monitor their suspect beginning at 400 p.m. My relief shift commenced at 4 p.m. today, with my own shift concluding at 10 p.m. My colleagues will continue their duties until 2 a.m. This was a convenient arrangement for my schedule. Additionally, I had sufficient time to commence the divorce process before my duties began in law enforcement. Intelligence work has its advantages. I have access to legal counsel. I requested a referral from a colleague for a highly regarded divorce attorney. Interestingly, I had spoken with the lawyer recommended by my colleague on numerous occasions but was unaware of her specialization in divorce law. Bonnie Keita, a prominent criminal defense attorney, was renowned for her tenacity. I am optimistic that she will. I had assumed that I would not require her assistance in the divorce proceedings. However, given the unexpected nature of life, I sought to gather irrefutable evidence to use against Meg and Ray. It was my intention to compel Meg to satisfy my requests in the divorce or face the consequences of her actions in relation to her work and her reputation within the profession. I removed my billet artisan model from my locker, 8.5338 sniper rifle, from my possession on a regular basis and frequently took it with me on surveillance missions. As a precautionary measure, I consulted with the weapons team to ascertain that all field weapons had been correctly registered. Furthermore, I retained one of the Browning sniper rifles that had been recovered from the suspects during our previous operation. This specific firearm was unregistered and not on any agency records, rendering it untraceable. I intended to utilize the Browning after loading the vehicle out of sight. I subsequently returned to my office and transferred half of the funds from our shared bank accounts to new accounts. I transferred all credit cards associated with joint accounts into my name. Additionally, I closed all accounts that were linked to our joint finances. My objective was to create a clear separation between our financial assets. I considered this approach equitable. My wife's financial affairs remained her responsibility, and any joint assets were divided between us or eliminated. The only outstanding issue was the house. My wife had been the primary resident, and I felt justified in claiming it. Furthermore, none of her misdeeds occurred at home, so the house remained untouched. In this regard, I was not careless. We had contemplated starting a family near the conclusion of our intelligence careers or later. Fortunately, we had no children yet, as that would have streamlined the procedure. It was surprising how calm I remained throughout the event. Over time, I became involved in morally questionable acts to help friends going through divorces. Sometimes it was as simple as using a camera to capture incriminating evidence. On other occasions, evidence was planted to elicit a confession. In both cases, I served as a supportive confidant, providing emotional assistance to my colleague until they were able to regain their composure. Despite my strong feelings for her, Meg was forced to interact with some uncomfortable and discouraging dinner guests. I maintained a calm demeanor regarding the situation, recognizing that our connection was irreparable after witnessing what I had. I sought resolution, but not in the conventional manner. I desired for Meg to experience the same emotional distress that I had. In addition, I desired for her to experience a significant loss of her own, in a manner similar to my own loss of her. Ultimately, she encountered her accomplice, a man who had betrayed not only a fellow agent but also his marriage, integrity, and country. He too deserved substantial repercussions. His losses would be significant and would occur that night or the next morning. Upon awakening, I instinctively reached out for Dan, only to find an empty space beside me. I felt his absence acutely, as though he were somehow still there. This was an irrational assumption, given that we had shared an intimate moment less than a day ago, alone in bed. I recalled that he must have been asleep when I returned last night, as I lay awake, likely anticipating an early morning obligation. I reflected on last night's mission and my life in general. I concluded that I needed to control my impulses and take responsibility for my actions. History had shown that indulging in such desires always resulted in trouble, and I had too much at stake. This may sound melodramatic. However, I was unable to envisage a life without Dan. Consequently, when I was preparing to leave the house for work, I opted for trousers over a skirt. They were not only more practical in an emergency, but they also served as a deterrent, making me less inclined to engage in extracurricular activities as I proceeded through security. I became aware of the guard's gaze upon me, which struck me as curious because I had not noticed it before. I wondered if guards always looked at female employees and agents in that way or if it was just me. In the distance, I observed Kelly Tano Shada gathering her belongings in preparation for entering the main lobby. If I hastened my pace and she lingered, I could circumvent the large metal door before it closed, thereby avoiding the necessity of waiting for it to complete its sequence. I was convinced she had observed me, yet as I approached the door, it closed. I uttered a curse, silently. She could have waited. Kelly and I had never seen eye to eye, to put it mildly. I held her in high disdain, and I was fairly certain she felt the same way about me. She had the typical long silky black. The woman, an Asian, had long hair, legs, a full bosom, and a commanding stride. She defied stereotypes. She was capable of halting traffic. She was the team's most skilled linguist, fluent in Spanish, Arabic, and Russian. I proceeded directly to the Situation Room, hoping to find my husband. However, I did not succeed. I consulted the operations board and discovered that his operation was not scheduled to begin until 2 p.m. I was perplexed. Why did he not wait for me? It seemed probable that he was helping one of his friends with their personal issues once again. I was frustrated. I had missed him, particularly since I was in urgent need of communication with him. When I called his mobile phone, it rang several times before going to voicemail. I proceeded with haste to the armory, hoping to intercept him as he prepared for his mission. The armory personnel informed me that he had already checked out his sniper rifle. I was at a loss as to his whereabouts. My thoughts turned to our future plans, including the prospect of our children moving into a larger home and pursuing careers that we could discuss with them with pride. Peers, I even considered assuming the role of a homemaker, dedicated solely to raising Dan's children. However, these goals appeared to be jeopardized by the possibility that our current operation would fail, despite our previous success. Last night marked the first and only setback in my experience. I attributed it to mere bad luck, but it nonetheless caused me discomfort. Dan's failure to attend to me last night, in addition to the aforementioned setback, contributed to my anxiety, resulting in involuntary trembling of my legs beneath my desk in the run-up to the operation. Despite Dan's attempts to contact me, I spent the majority of my time in the office engaged in a seemingly interminable phone conversation with him. His messages, however, had an odd tone. They were overly formal, reminiscent of conversations with a colleague rather than a spouse. I sensed that something was amiss. I was unable to shake the suspicion that the trouble Ree and I had narrowly avoided the previous night had reached Dan's attention. Given his friendship with the section chief, it was possible that he was keeping his distance from me at work to avoid any potential difficulties. It would be disadvantageous for either of us to be unemployed. It is conceivable that he was displeased with me for placing him in the position of having to vouch for me to Annie once more. He had done so previously during my probation as an agent and had promised never to do so again. This is likely what averted trouble for Ree and me 4 hours later. Ree and I resumed our duties, and the agents on duty informed us that our target, Mr. Galacticos, was asleep after a night of drinking. "Hello, Meg." Ree apologized for everything. He stated that his primary emotion last night was frustration at our inability to apprehend the individual in question. He then inquired as to whether we were all emotionally stable. I responded that, when I am stressed, I tend to make mistakes, and that mistakes and stress can have fatal consequences in our line of work. I then explained that I would not make the same mistake again, but that I needed to be able to express my emotions. Ree interjected, stating that he was simply upset the previous night and that my lips were far more appealing than his wife's. He then reiterated his desire for a fully intimate relationship with me. He requested intimacy, apologizing. However, I replied that while relaxation is beneficial, Dan is the sole proprietor of all other aspects. I had been on duty for approximately 5 hours when it was 7, the time was 12 a.m. My replacement was not scheduled to arrive until 10 o'clock. At 7 p.m., my partner was asleep. Earlier, I had rented a car and parked my Mustang in its usual spot. However, I was unable to drive it for 2 reasons. First, I was concerned that if there was an investigation, they would look at my tire tracks. Second, the engine and exhaust system of the car were so loud that both my colleagues and the suspects could hear them. I was aware that the team that checked on me every hour or so would not come while I was gone. Andy Taylor, whom I had supported during his divorce, was unaware of my plans. He would not pay me a visit until I returned after starting the tape at 7 p.m. The time is 7 p.m. 4 nights prior, I opened the rear window of the improvised concealment structure I was utilizing and traversed to the adjacent edifice I had designated for this purpose. I exercised caution to avoid leaving any additional footprints that could alert an investigator to my absence upon my arrival at the ground. I then entered my rental vehicle and drove 3 miles to my observation point. I proceeded to set up my digital camera to observe Meg and her associate, Ree. I then positioned my Browning and looked through the scope. It became evident that they had initiated the process without my presence. Meg appeared to be focused on the subject's residence while Ree engaged in inappropriate behavior despite having them both in Browning's sights. I refrained from taking action. I did not wish to commit murder, so I observed as Meg patted Ray on the shoulder, which was a familiar gesture for them. Even from a distance, I noted that when Meg knelt down, a smile appeared on his lips and they were moistened. When Meg was next to Ree, who was having difficulty focusing on the process, she appeared more concerned than pleased, despite my own experience. I knew Meg was capable of more than she demonstrated at the time. She was capable of more than she demonstrated at the time. It was evident that she did not enjoy the experience. I was compelled to consider the possibility that he held some influence over her. I aimed once more, this time for the center of Ree's abdomen and Meg's mouth. Precision was of the essence. An inadvertent shot could potentially end my unfaithful wife's life. Breathing evenly, I gently pulled the trigger, almost instinctively firing a high. I then proceeded to fire a high-velocity projectile directly at the target. Through the Browning scope, I observed Meg's startled expression as Ray's instrument was abruptly removed. Ray experienced acute discomfort amidst the prevailing chaos, and Meg expelled a portion of the instrument and attempted to pacify him by persuading him to recline for an examination. Initially, Ree assumed that Meg was the cause of his injury. I then collected the Browning and returned to my rental vehicle after driving for several miles. I rapidly traversed the alleyway and I proceeded to traverse the final block to the edifice situated in close proximity to my surveillance point, ascending the rope to re-enter my surveillance shack. As I did so, I listened to the audio recording, which captured my ongoing commentary on the subject's activities from 4 nights prior. I paused the recording intermittently to interject observations regarding the subject's current state of repose. Despite my inability to discern their reaction when I relayed a somewhat inane joke, I postulated that they might have found it amusing, despite its lack of sophistication. How might one engage a sweet 80-year-old? I inquired as to whether it would be possible to obtain the services of another 80-year-old lady to vocalize the expletive in question. I suggested that this would be a viable solution, and that the surveillance team would have a comprehensive recording of the night's activities, including my own commentary, commencing at 2 p.m. The time was 10 a.m. My shift concluded a few hours later at 10 o'clock. I was confident that I would not be suspected of harming Ree, particularly given that we were friends and I had no apparent motive. Furthermore, my firearm had not been discharged. I proceeded to dispose of the Browning in a manner that rendered it untraceable, and it was widely known that I loved Meg too much to risk hurting her in order to eliminate myself as a suspect. I was under no illusion that I would be able to avoid a polygraph test. I was familiar with Aries' methods and assumed that he would summon me soon to be replaced by someone else. This individual would then lead me into the conference room, which we occasionally used to question important or high-profile witnesses. Profile witnesses would provide a detailed account of the incident and inquire as to whether I possessed any pertinent information. Carter Hall, our polygraph expert, would be present to evaluate my veracity and responses. Carter would utilize one of the newer machines, which eliminates the necessity for physical connections, detecting lies through voice stress analysis and heart rate fluctuations. Carter, with whom I had previously collaborated, reassured me that I would pass the test. The scenario unfolded largely as anticipated, with the exception of Aries' absence of disruption to my ongoing operation. He demonstrated patience by waiting for the entirety of the 2-hour period until I concluded, even listening in on some of my conversations in a timely manner. He subsequently summoned me to the interrogation room. Upon my arrival, his demeanor seemed nonchalant, as if nothing unusual was occurring. It was evident that Ari had not fulfilled his potential in the field of acting. He should have pursued that career path. He began, "There is no need to panic. Everything is under control regarding Meg." He continued, "She is okay, just a bit shaken." I immediately rose from my seat. I had a propensity for theatrics. I was visibly distressed, and I demanded to know what had happened to Meg. Dan attempted to calm me, reiterating that she was safe. However, he informed me that there had been a shootout involving Meg and Ray during their mission that night. I was shocked to learn that Meg had been shot. Dan explained that it was Ray who had been struck, and that I was not aware of this. I was taken aback and replied, "No. I was using one. It would have been beneficial to have some form of communication." I added that AR had exited the room, indicating his intention to speak with Carter. When he returned a few minutes later, he informed me of Meg's whereabouts. She was undergoing a debriefing on the incident, and her account differed slightly from the findings of the investigating officers. I hastened to the debriefing room and peered through the glass to observe Frank Casper conversing with Meg. I gestured to him, but he shook his head, indicating that I should not enter. This was not unexpected, as I would likely prefer not to have the husband's presence during an interview with a distressed individual. I departed and returned to Aries' apartment. I proceeded to the apartment in a quiet manner and tapped on the door before entering. "What is the situation?" I inquired. "Meg is currently downstairs with Frank, and he has indicated that I am not to allow you to join them," he replied, motioning for me to sit down. "There is a peculiar occurrence taking place, and at this moment, you are one of my few trusted agents," he stated. "Previously, I indicated that when we spoke, I needed to review your comments with the VCA. He clarified that you were telling the truth and confirmed your heartbeat. I also urged that despite your outrage when I acknowledged Meg's presence, you remain truthful. Additionally, I listened to approximately 2 hours of your operation today, notably between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. The hours in question are 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. He continued, stating that aside from the aforementioned jests, you were as professional as ever. He concluded with a grimace, remarking that observing a lowlife for 8 hours a day would drive anyone to seek entertainment. However, this was not sufficient. I had psychologists examine your recording, and he then proceeded to determine that you were innocent. Furthermore, he stated that both your handgun and the sniper rifle you were carrying were unused and of the wrong caliber. I attempted to intervene, but he lifted his hand, effectively silencing me. The monitoring crew of your unit indicated that you were still inside the surveillance shack at 7. The time was 30 p.m. 2 minutes prior to the occurrence of the event, he recalled that he had dispatched an incident team to investigate the scene. He observed that there was only one set of tire tracks, which matched the vehicle in question. He noted that the vehicle in question never left the hut. Additionally, he stated that the only tracks found were those of the vehicle entering and exiting the shack once, as well as those of the handlers who were nearby. He then came to a conclusion. I demanded, "Why are you interrogating me?" I asserted that he was utterly clueless. He replied, "I would understand if someone simply informed me of anything." I snapped, "I informed you yesterday about Meg and Ray's mismanagement of their monitoring." He began, "I also mentioned that I'd wait until after the operation to decide how to handle it." He continued, "They returned to duty tonight at approximately 7. The time was 32 p.m. Unidentified individuals attacked them." He claimed he went on to say that the shooter appeared to be either extremely lucky or highly talented. However, you stated that Meg was not hurt. I yelled, I saw her, she's fine, she was unharmed throughout the shooting. He clarified, so how did she become hurt? I inquired. I slumped into a chair, yet inside I was calm, even amused. I could tell that Ari spotted red stains on Meg's body, most likely at the crime site. Perhaps he was attempting to spare me the specifics. However, it was evident that she had red stains on her face and upper body, but significantly fewer on her lower body and stomach. If they had been in close proximity, their abdominal cavities would have exhibited an identical number of red markings. The evidence suggested that Meg's face was in close proximity to Ray's abdomen. Additionally, he neglected to inform me that Meg's saliva was located on the end of Ray's equipment. Furthermore, he disregarded the fact that forensic scientists discovered no evidence of tissue on Ray's instrument, which implies that it is probable that Ray's instrument was located on the pistol when he was shot. There is no evidence to suggest that Ray would remove his instrument while Meg's head was positioned on his abdomen. Dan, we have been friends for a considerable period of time, and I am committed to investigating this matter thoroughly. I suggest that you return home after interviewing Meg. I anticipate that it will be a lengthy evening. I will require the opportunity to speak with her, and I believe that you and Meg should engage in a frank discussion when she arrives home. He proposed that perhaps working for the same agency is not the optimal decision for both of you. I insist. While awaiting Meg's return, I advised Dan to return home and await her arrival. He placed an order and instructed me to contact him once she was on the premises. He also encouraged her to notify me as soon as she concluded her business and departed the building. I inquired if I could remain at the scene until her return. I added that I would attempt to rest, as I had no early shift the following day. I suggested that he consider the same. Ari recommended that I take a few days off. I inquired as to why I needed this time off. He replied, please let me know if you change your mind. After leaving Ari's office, I called Bonnie and left a message for her to call me at her earliest convenience. I was surprised to hear her voice remain in her office. Hello, Bonnie. I'm Daniel. Hello, Daniel, she responded. Her voice had that deep quality that I had come to recognize. The quality of smoke that I have always found attractive in a lady was not something I expected to see. I was just about to send you a message to that effect. I proceeded to explain that if it comes to your paperwork and you utilize a reconciler and differences as the grounds for divorce, it is perhaps the simplest thing in the world to do. She responded that there is nothing to prove on either side in your situation, given that there are no children. You have already divided the finances, and she has agreed to relinquish the house, so the matter is essentially settled. I can have her served tomorrow, and I can even prosecute the other person for affectional alienation if necessary. How did you know? I inquired, and I have had the opportunity to interact with you in a professional capacity on a few occasions. Tease proceeded to share her insights, indicating that she was aware of my admiration for my wife and the unlikelihood of my infidelity. She also mentioned that other attorneys she had encountered had informed her of my wife's somewhat lax conduct in legal and court settings. This led her to conclude that it was likely my wife who was violating the established rules. Thank you, Bonnie, I responded, before disconnecting the call. After providing her with the address and Meg's office number, I entered my vehicle and drove aimlessly, listening to the day's mediocre radio options and contemplating the missteps in my life. Previously, I was arguably the happiest individual, with a meticulously planned existence, a fulfilling occupation, a supportive partner, and a seemingly flawless life. However, I am currently experiencing a sense of despair. I am uncertain whom I can confide in, particularly not Meg. I have transgressed the boundaries of acceptable conduct, jeopardizing the safety of a colleague and the stability of my marriage. The future, including the next day, is shrouded in uncertainty. In all honesty, I have been preoccupied with Meg and her actions, particularly her frequent change of romantic partners over the past year. It seems as if she cycles through them at a rapid pace. At an alarming rate, perhaps they move through her just as quickly. I am left wondering how many of the men I rely on for support have already had sexual relationships with my wife. There are many sides to consider. Ree was probably not the first. After traveling for a while, I realized I was hungry, so I went in search of an open diner. That is when I noticed another Mustang was parked outside a classic Coney. This seemed to be an omen, so I drove in next to it and stepped inside the diner. There was a night cook with a scruffy appearance behind a greasy counter and a lone client at a table away from the windows. The client was eating coney, which was full of pickles. I ordered to go while sitting next to the other customer. The cook gave me a questioning glance, but I simply replied that pickles taste good. I proceeded to elucidate the particular vehicle in question, which was an 8-year-old charcoal gray GTI. In response, he inquired about the year of my vehicle, which I informed him was a 6-year-old screaming yellow GTI. He then offered a compliment, stating that he admired my painting. In turn, I complimented him on his own work, noting that I sometimes wished I had a similar talent. He then made a remark about the difficulty of attracting attention with a brilliant yellow Mustang, suggesting that it is a vehicle that is difficult to miss. I agreed with this assessment but noted that it is not always possible to avoid such a vehicle's visibility. I inquired as to how this could be, as the cook handed me the sack and I observed the horse emblem on the front. He informed me that the horse is an American emblem, representing freedom, but noted that it is not fleeing from anything. He maintained eye contact with me, and I observed a pony charging right into the fray, much like us. The Mustang was charging directly at them and raising hell. I felt a surge of determination as I sat somewhat taller than before. I revved my engine louder than was necessary as I exited the parking lot. It was evident that avoidance was no longer an option, action was required. Following my debriefing, I was directed to proceed directly to Ari's office. He sharply chastised me and stated that an extensive internal and external investigation would be conducted. He had previously exonerated a few agents in the team, including Dan. However, I intend to question everyone he mentioned after consulting with some of my past partners. I observed their odd conduct after learning about Ray. I was asked if I had any knowledge of this matter. He advised me to refrain from any action and to take the remainder of the evening and the following morning off. I was instructed to report to him the following afternoon, at which point he would have reviewed the preliminary findings and the site cruise report. He emphasized that if there were any issues I wished to bring to his attention, I should do so voluntarily. He subsequently afforded me the opportunity to return home, confer with Dan, and determine my subsequent actions and desired outcome once the investigation was concluded. Additionally, he advised me that Dan was eager for me to contact him once I had departed the premises. The fact that Dan wanted to meet with me was the most encouraging news I had received all day. My mind was racing, wondering what Dan knew, who he had spoken with, and how much information I should divulge to him, particularly given the potential for this information to be disseminated, was unclear. I had just over 12 hours to devise a solution, but there appeared to be no viable path forward. Perhaps the most prudent course of action would be to acknowledge the nature of my involvement with Ree and request my resignation. This would allow us to maintain our long-standing relationship. I inquired as to the nature of our relationship. I requested that he not involve Ree's wife or Dan. If I were to choose between my career and my marriage, I would undoubtedly choose my marriage. I would, however, miss the exhilaration and sense of responsibility that came with serving my nation. I could not fathom giving up Dan. The concept evoked a sense of warmth and contentment within me. I envisioned myself pregnant, bearing a small version of both Dan and myself. It seemed like an ideal scenario, particularly as I drove away from the parking garage. I proceeded to call his phone number, and was pleasantly surprised when he responded. Dan is on his way, he said. Sweetie, I replied, expressing my eagerness to experience the warmth. He had a knack for soothing any situation. We needed to discuss our future. I brought up my employment, but he was unyielding. Dan, I don't want to give up my career, I pleaded. Perhaps now is the moment to examine what lies ahead. That was not what he meant. His voice was devoid of passion, a quality that had never before been evident. I became aware of the extent of your indignation, yet there are certain factors that you are unaware of. I informed him that we would resume our discussion when I returned. Meg, I advise you to refrain from interfering. He demanded that she go to her mother's book, a motel, and sleep in her car. He made it clear that he no longer considered this to be her home. He stated that our future was non-existent. I am aware of the situation, and I am indifferent to your employment status. Meg, I am more knowledgeable about the situation than you realize, and there is nothing else to discuss. I was unable to maintain composure, and tears streamed down my cheeks, evoking the anguished cries of a child rather than the controlled emotions of an adult. After driving aimlessly for approximately 30 minutes, I checked into a modest motel in the vicinity of the airport. I disrobed and retired to bed. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen. I responded promptly upon seeing Dan's name on the screen. I greeted him cordially, anticipating that he would request my return home. However, I was unprepared for his next statement. He informed me that, while he had tried to be fair throughout this process, asking me not to return home on such short notice was an unreasonable demand on his part. He then proposed that we meet at the house the following morning, suggesting that we could discuss the situation further in person. He was then interrupted before he had the chance to complete his sentence. "Meg," he began, but was once again cut off. "I'm not ready to chat yet. Perhaps not ever. I merely wanted to give you the opportunity to collect some of your personal stuff from the property." He then went on to explain that he was going to be away for the night, and that she was free to come by the following day to collect her belongings. "Dan, forget about. I love you, Dan. You are the most essential thing to me, the most precious thing I own. You don't have me anymore, Meg." He replied that he and I were separated from Ree and anybody else I had been involved with. I realized that he was aware of my feelings. My heart gripped. It wasn't only about keeping my career or concealing my extracurricular activities anymore. Dan was notified, and I was engaged in a desperate struggle for survival, aware that I could not survive without him. He was not only aware of this fact but had also reached the deliberate conclusion that our marriage could not be salvaged. I lay there, gazing at the scarred and lined ceiling, questioning my own actions. I had everything and had squandered everything I needed to find a way to win him back, regardless of the cost. However, I did not engage in sexual intercourse with anyone. I informed them that I was not interested and simply provided them with the bill. I began to speak with them but then terminated the conversation before I could fully express myself. Dan terminated the call the following day. I awoke at approximately midday and proceeded to check out of the motel. I could always return to another one, but I will now be returning to my home. I dressed and I entered the vehicle and considered the nuances of human psychology. I felt a sense of unease in wearing the same attire as the previous day. However, I had engaged in infidelity for an extended period without experiencing any moral qualms until my husband discovered the truth. Firstly, there was no direct physical contact, which I did not perceive as a genuine betrayal. Secondly, the experience provided a sense of relief from the adrenaline rush and prepared me for actual intimacy with Dan. Additionally, it is important to note that my interactions with anyone other than Dan have consistently been mutually satisfying. There was no kissing, caressing, or embracing. These acts were exclusively intended for Dan. Furthermore, I did not have a preference for any of these men, with the exception of Dan. With the exception of Dan, I did not form an emotional attachment to any of the other men. I did not envisage a future with any of them, with the exception of one. They were all content in their marriages. I felt the need to clarify this with Dan because our conversation the previous day revealed that he accused me of adultery. This has never happened and it will never happen, perhaps. He could distinguish between infidelity and a minor misstep. As I pulled into our driveway, my mind was racing with thoughts of resentment, rage, anguish, and remorse. I have numerous positive memories associated with this home. I was perplexed by his assumption that I would simply abandon it in such a state. Upon entering the house, I proceeded to survey the interior, examining every detail as though it were my inaugural or perhaps sole visit. I ascended the stairs with haste and collapsed onto our bed, greeted by Dan's lingering scent as I enveloped myself in the sheets. I found immense pleasure in this experience, though I suspect I may have appeared peculiar, rolling about on the bed like a human. The warmth and Dan's aroma, however, reassured me that I had not irreparably damaged my marriage. Nevertheless, I was consumed by anxiety and a rush of adrenaline from fieldwork. Perhaps if I had allowed time to elapse, I could have adapted like everyone else did. The primary cause of this situation was the M's actions. Despite being married, they engaged in sexual intercourse for the purpose of fostering closeness. At the very least, this increased my job performance. I am not claiming to be a victim, but I do not accept full responsibility for the situation. I had to explain everything to Dan, confident that even with all of the facts, he would still be furious with me. However, I believed he would eventually forgive me. He would eventually forgive me. One thing was definite in my life: Dan's love for me. Despite the strength of my feelings for him, I untangled myself and gently folded the blanket. I intended to take it with me when I left, as I knew that if we were separated for an extended period of time, I would need it for comfort. I removed my clothing and proceeded to the bathroom, recalling our efforts to select the wallpaper and tiles for the room. Initially, Den was reluctant to approve the cost of the tiles until we had our first bath together in the spacious tub after activating the shower. I stepped beneath the spray of water, reminiscing about the times we spent together in the shower. Upon reflection, I realized how much I had taken these moments for granted, understanding their significance. We now recognize that it is not grand gestures but rather modest, everyday occurrences that shape our lives and form the most powerful memories. I proceeded to dry myself and observed in the span of 5 years, my reflection in the full-length mirror revealed a notable transformation in my body. My formerly thin physique had become more curvaceous and slightly thicker, although my breasts had begun to sag. My buttocks, however, remained firm and perky, likely due to my daily exercise regimen. Interestingly, my face seemed to have aged more rapidly in the past 24 hours than it had in the preceding year. In the preceding 24 hours, my face had aged at a faster rate than it had in the previous year. I was wrapped in one of Dan's thick robes, which still contained his aroma. I proceeded down the stairs toward the kitchen, the familiar aroma of my favorite French roast coffee filling the room. Tears welled up in my eyes once more. Dan had never expressed a fondness for my coffee. However, he had left the coffee maker on a low setting to maintain its warmth for me. A caramel nut bagel and a letter were situated on the kitchen counter adjacent to the coffee maker. I approached the note with trepidation, contemplating the chill of our previous conversation. "Meg," he began, "I truly regret the manner in which our relationship concluded. I would do anything to alter that outcome. Anything to undo it. You have been the foundation of my existence for as long as I can remember, and losing you will be difficult to recover from. It is my hope that we can approach this matter with professionalism and decency. Unfortunately, that dream will never come true. All I ask is that we approach this matter with respect and understanding. In regard to the matter of professionalism and decency, it is imperative to avoid the pitfalls of rage and hatred. I have provided you with sufficient time to gather your personal belongings. I kindly request that you extend the same courtesy to me. Please take possession of any items that rightfully belong to you, regardless of whether they were purchased separately or together. I ask that you refrain from taking or damaging my personal belongings. A list of shared goods that I wish to retain will be provided, and I will indicate which items I am not interested in. The remaining items will be discussed. I intend to retain the house because I believe it is fair under the circumstances. However, if the house becomes uninhabitable for me in the future, I will offer it to you. If you decline, we can sell it and split the proceeds. There is little more to be said except that we are both experiencing difficulties at this time. I may not fully comprehend the anguish you are feeling, but I have no hatred toward you and wish for you to find someone who provides you with the joy you offered me, Danny Almond." When I finished writing the note, I was overcome by a rush of emotions. I was approximately 2 to 3 hours away from meeting Ari, and I was uncertain about how to proceed. Was it worth going at all? Eventually, I ceased to care about my job. I decided to inform AR that I had been involved with several colleagues. I was not an exemplary agent, in fact, I was the least effective they could have had. I had reached the point of no return and was prepared to be fired. My primary concern at that moment was to speak with Dan. He was not aware of the full circumstances and implications. If he were to learn of the extent of my involvement, the situation might become more challenging. I was acting out of self-interest. Simply put, I had a partner who loved me. I was sincerely in love with him, and all he wanted in return was my equal love. I was acutely aware of the pain I was causing him. I could only hope that it was not too late. My telephone rang. It was from a hospital. Ree had awoken and requested to see me. I was working with a partner on my early surveillance shift. This time, we were informed by intelligence sources that a potential new deal involving my target was imminent. Therefore, it was necessary to maintain surveillance and be prepared for any eventuality. My boyfriend, who was temporarily residing with me, had recently relocated from another state, which was a positive development as it meant that I only had to consider his involvement in the event of a crisis. I was not concerned about whether he had also been involved in my wife's activities. I spoke into the microphone and observed that another vehicle was entering the scene. The visitor appeared to be a woman. I continued to provide a detailed description of my observations, as even minor details could be significant. The suspect invited the woman entered the house. I proceeded to utilize my sniper rifle, focusing the scope through the front windows. I observed the suspect, ECT, engaged in conversation with the woman, who appeared to be the dominant figure. She handed him a piece of paper, which he acknowledged with a nod and placed on the table. She then embraced him and led him into a back room. Rose promptly retrieved my cell phone and digital camera, while Charles proceeded downstairs to monitor the situation and notify me of any return. I provided instructions, emphasizing the potential consequences of compromising the operation, including capture, injury, or worse. However, like an experienced agent, Charles swiftly assessed the situation. I acknowledged the situation with a simple nod. I proceeded to descend the slope with great caution, maintaining a close observation of the entrance through which the subjects had entered. I sought out any available cover, eventually taking refuge behind the subject's vehicle. From this vantage point, I was able to discern the paper, but the inscription from my observation post was. As I pointed the camera lens at it, I took pictures at various magnifications and angles amidst the sounds of movement and quiet coming from the next room. I was struck by a cynical thought. Everyone in the area appeared to be preoccupied with intimate matters, with the exception of me, who was concerned about the potential consequences of getting caught. I considered asking the person inside about their meetings with Meg while carefully checking the front door. Luck smiled at me as it swung open. After eavesdropping, I was convinced that they were still taking advantage of the opportunity. I quickly went to the table, took 3 detailed photographs of the newspaper, and then left. Unfortunately, just as I was about to close the door, I heard another creak open. I knew that any attempt to escape would almost certainly result in detection. I hurriedly removed the SD card from the camera and threw it down the slope with all my might. I knocked on the door. I then proceeded to knock on the door and await a response. After a few minutes, the man approached the door and opened it slightly. I was immediately struck by the notion that a firearm might be concealed behind it. "Excuse me, sir," I said, attempting to maintain a somewhat inebriated composure. "My vehicle has run out of fuel, and I was wondering if I might be able to use yours. You are the only residents for quite some distance around here." I slurred. "I don't have a telephone." He snapped with a thick accent. "You better leave before things get worse," he warned. I stepped back, pretending to almost fall off the porch, and then started walking in the wrong direction. "Hey idiot," he exclaimed. "You are going the wrong way." I stumbled and fell on my backside, staring up at him in confusion. "Where am I going again?" I inquired, feigning confusion. He pointed up the hillside. "Right," I muttered, and began to stumble my way up the hill. After slipping out of their sight, I quickly changed course. I returned to the shack from which I had initially departed. I arrived just in time to see a car pull up in front of the shack. 2 additional agents emerged from the car. "Dan, have you lost your mind?" Andy Taylor exclaimed. All was for naught. "You had to abandon the camera," he said, "but what about the crucial part?" I countered, taking the memory card from my pocket. "You must return those to base immediately," he said. "We will release you from duty early. Inform Annie to update the next team schedule. I'm staying here any longer than necessary," he added, lowering his voice. "I've got a date tonight." "You're acting just like I did when I went through," he said, turning to Dan. "We need to have a serious conversation later. If she is not worth risking your life for," I returned to the office and handed over the memory card to Ari. He inserted it into his PC's card reader while browsing the images. Upon seeing the ones I had captured from a distance, he appeared puzzled. "Perhaps the technical team could improve these," he proposed. He then proceeded to scroll down to the last 6, as I had suggested. "Damn, you're amazing," he exclaimed. "How on earth did you get these?" he inquired. "They appear to have been taken from within the room," he marveled. "That is correct," I replied. Ari was confirmed to be a friend of mine, as previously stated. He regarded me with a discerning gaze, as if evaluating me. "Dan and I are both aware that there is a significant issue at hand, one that we are both attempting to circumvent," he stated, in a measured tone. "I am not yet fully apprised of the circumstances, but I am aware that Meg is involved, and I have a strong suspicion regarding the manner in which she was included." Additionally, I perceive that you are aware of certain aspects of this situation, and I sense that it is a considerable burden for you. However, I urge you not to take any unnecessary risks merely because you are going through a challenging period. He advised that our line of work is challenging. Over half of his agents, including those who are not romantically involved in the field, get divorced. He proceeded to share that he has been married and divorced 3 times. However, he emphasized that he cannot afford to lose me as an asset or friend. He then asked if I would be willing to be reassigned to a desk until this situation resolves itself. He also inquired as to whether I would be able to handle this. I assured him that I would not take any more unnecessary risks. He stated that he would contact me as soon as he had an opportunity to do so. He commended the information obtained from the photographs, noting that it was good work. I proceeded to the shooting range for an hour of target practice, which not only enhanced my aim but also allowed me to relax. Given that I had granted Meg access to the house for the day, this was my only option. I subsequently visited the gym to engage in weight training for the first 20 minutes, during which I was alone. Then, I heard a voice from behind me. It was a female voice, and she said, "I've heard you've become some sort of super." I turned to see Kelly and Matcha, who was attired in a leotard-like workout outfit. I had observed her in the vicinity of the building for years. She was conspicuous, yet I had been preoccupied with Meg and thus had not paid much attention to anyone else. "I'm just doing my job," I replied. "I prefer to dress in a way that is as comfortable as possible," she began. "As comfortable as I can be in public," she continued, leaving the statement open to multiple interpretations. "This is my final set, as I mentioned, so you will have your privacy returned in a moment. I am starting to warm up to the idea of having a workout partner," she said. "I also have a suggestion," she added, tilting her head slightly to indicate her desire to hear her suggestion. She elaborated, "The field agents received excellent training, particularly in self-defense." She made a point of noting that I was the first person she had ever heard use etc. in a sentence, which prompted a smile. I had not smiled since I learned of Meg's involvement, as that incident had lifted my spirits and relieved some of the tension I had been feeling. In light of this, she proposed that we engage in a match, gesturing towards the sparring area. The rubberized floors in the back of my mind are a source of concern. I have a vague recollection of someone mentioning Kelly's expertise as a black belt in a martial art, but I cannot be certain. I also recall hearing about her proclivity to humiliate field agents by outperforming them in spontaneous sparring matches. I found myself she responded with a smile, which struck me as odd. I was unsure what she meant by that. Kelly aimed a front snap kick at my head as soon as we met on the mat before I could react. I quickly sidestepped, noticing her pivot as she planted her foot, and it became evident that the kick was not intended to make contact. Rather, it was utilized as a strategy to narrow the distance and breach my defense. She then unleashed a series of rapid blows, which were surprisingly forceful for someone of her size, aimed at my ribs, causing me to retreat and circle her with a shark-like precision. Her grin suggested that she believed she had the upper hand. I returned her smile and took stock of the situation. She was clearly more proficient in quick attacks and strategic retreats than I was. However, my larger muscle mass gives me an advantage in terms of strength, which allows me to exercise more endurance. Furthermore, my experience as a field agent provided me with acute situational awareness, allowing me to pinpoint precisely what needed to be done. I gently rubbed the sawed-off ribs from her previous strikes. Predictably, she stopped circling and launched another. I anticipated her various tactics and was therefore able to evade her mid-level roundhouse kick. Undeterred, she aimed subsequent punches at my weak spot, hoping to exploit it. This played into my expectations, and I was therefore able to absorb her initial hit. I then reacted with a measured technique, a blend of a kung fu open palm. I struck her with a punch and a gent push, taking care not to cause her harm. My open hand made contact with her chin with considerable force, causing her head to snap back and forcing her to collapse to the mat. At that moment, I observed a distinct expression of fear in her eyes, which soon gave way to a look of defiance as she attempted to defend herself. While I myself was still reeling from the impact, I pulled myself together and pulled her hands above her head. Her head was startled one by one, both by my welcome and her sudden helplessness against me, despite her restricted state. There was a touch of satisfaction in her smile and barely visible movements from being subservient. When I met her eyes, I understood that she was not only smiling but also gripping. She was embracing me with her entire body. It was as if she was saying, "It's almost done." My mind was flooded with a multitude of conflicting emotions and sensations. Despite being married, I found myself overwhelmed by a sense of longing. I reminded myself that my partner was not considering the implications of his actions. Why should I hesitate? Caught off guard by my uncertainty, Kelly seized the initiative. She wrapped her legs around me, adjusting our posture so that she was on top of me. From a moral standpoint, we shouldn't engage in this act. I was able to claim that I am married. If at least half of the rumors are correct, it will not survive long. She kissed you. You're not the type to. She asserted that infidelity is not something that should be tolerated, particularly when one is faithful to another person. The situation seemed to unfold like a scene from a movie, and just as I was about to give up, Meg's voice suddenly rang out behind us. I felt as though we were in a horror movie, and she yelled, "Get away from him." Then, she threw her arms around Kelly. I grasped Kelly's waist and forcibly removed her from my vicinity. Kelly swiftly rose to her feet and confronted Meg, who exhibited no indications of retreating. I interjected by grasping Meg's waist and pushing her away. "Perhaps we can discuss this further at another time," I commented. "I highly doubt that I have any say in it," Meg replied. In a harsh tone, Kelly responded, "I will send you my phone number via email from Ree's hospital room when I depart the gym." She reminded me of countless others I had seen over the years. The sterile blend of gray and pale blue, intended to inspire cheerfulness, actually added to the dreariness of the room. Despite any efforts to improve the mood with paint or decorations, the pervasive reality of illness or sorrow stifled any sense of hope. Most patients found peace only in the thought of returning home. As I closed the door behind me, I observed Ray's wife. As I forced a smile that I hoped was not too forced, it dawned on me that I had forgotten her name. Why bother knowing her name? She was not my wife, but his. I did not want to be there in the first place. Instead of consoling a grown man, I should have focused on my own concerns. He had the audacity to call me there like I had already saved his life. I was the one who seized him and threw him to the ground while he held on to what was left of his instrument. I was the one who used one of my hair bands and a rifle to apply a tourniquet and save his life. What else was he expecting from me? It's not as if I shot him or the man's voice was noticeably affected by the painkillers he was taking. It seemed as though he was attempting to convey that he wished to be left alone with the infant. The discussion was, in fact, about work-related matters. I informed him that I was unable to discuss these issues in such a public setting. I then handed him the flowers I had purchased from the gift shop. I was compelled to revisit the store downstairs. I was unable to recall her name and was on the verge of addressing her as baby. My efforts to alleviate my wife's suffering have ultimately proved futile. However, I did discern one aspect of her relationship with Ree that I had not previously been aware of. It was either a matter she had not disclosed to me or one she was indifferent about. I reached this conclusion because if she had been aware and opposed to it, if she were aware of my feelings and expressed disagreement, I would have to address the resulting issues. I smiled and waved as she closed the door, and I heard the latch click. My expression shifted as I faced Ree. "Why did you summon me here?" I demanded. "I have obligations." I informed him that I would be meeting with Ari in approximately an hour and a half and that Den was also aware of our relationship. "I'm trying to salvage my marriage as much as I sympathize with you, but I have." I proceeded to outline other significant issues. Ray's demeanor became increasingly agitated, as evidenced by the elevated heart rate displayed on the screen. He then commented, "You are truly heartless." Ray continued, stating, "I brought you here just to ask you a question." He then reiterated his willingness to provide assistance. He then shifted the focus of the discussion, noting that nearly everyone in the department had visited him, either while he was still upset or sad. He then inquired, "Is it then strange that my partner is one of the few who hasn't?" Dan shot me a look of disbelief. He inquired as to why I would even suggest such a thing. I replied that I had been pondering it extensively since I woke up. The ballistic experts were not meant to come, but they did, and they told me a few things. They believe it was fired from more than 4 miles away based on the round's penetration into the wall upon impact with me and in their caliber. They added that there are only 2 individuals in our team who could attempt such a shot. The team who could attempt such a shot is unknown, as are the ballistics experts. The latter are unaware of the difficulties presented by the shot. He continued, "Why was it more difficult?" I inquired because the individual who did it shot at my groin, a rather small target from such a distance, and missed you while you were moving. He clarified that only Ari in his peak and your husband Dan could have pulled off such a shot. He noted that as news spread about what happened to me, your former co-workers began acting oddly. The workers began exhibiting peculiar behavior, with some appearing to be protecting or nursing their own private parts. He stated that he did not believe any of them would willingly confront your husband. Have there been any indications that he was aware of this prior to questioning? I replied that I had returned home 2 nights ago and that he had not contacted me. He had also not waited for me and had not initiated intimacy, sleeping on the other side of the bed. I elaborated that I had assumed he was fatigued. The following morning, he departed without providing any explanation. I attempted to contact him throughout the day, but he declined to respond. I highlighted that he was unable to have shot you, given that he was engaged in an operation and there is continuous footage of him speaking throughout the mission and journey to the hospital. I emphasized that Dan could not have been in 2 places simultaneously and that he had also passed the visa and polygraph examinations. Furthermore, I noted that he was not aware of the shooting until after everyone else because he was out in the field. Ultimately, I was certain that it was him. It is likely that he would have shot both of us, I lamented. I am almost inclined to wish that he had, because if I am unable to find a way to bring him back, I might as well die. I confessed that I would prefer to take a quick, clean bullet than to continue suffering the misery of seeing him from afar, unable to touch or communicate with him. I could not face the prospect of watching him go on and date someone else. Ree remarked that this sounded like torture. The physicians are confident about repairing my genitalia to look normal, but the nerve damage from the bullet has hampered. He also noted that he was unsure whether I would ever be able to have children. He suggested that even if Betty did not discover our affair, which was likely after the website's report was released, she might still choose to leave me if we were unable to maintain a close relationship. I also spoke with Ari, who expressed concern that I might be demoted or even dismissed from my position. He also mentioned that, aside from attempting to determine whether your husband shot my instrument, I had attempted to warn you. Following our conversation, I am curious as to why he expressed such concern. I have instructed Ari to facilitate your return to the field as soon as possible to mitigate the impact of this unfortunate turn of events. It is worth noting that there is a general reluctance to assign women to field work unaccompanied. Additionally, there has been a notable request for transfers from the majority of your previous partners. This does not accurately reflect the circumstances, as even individuals with whom you have not previously collaborated appear to be reluctant to work with you. He acknowledged that rumors about me are spreading rapidly. Prior to our pairing, I had already heard some rumors about you. He conceded that our recent missteps have not enhanced your reputation. Perhaps that is how Dan became aware of us. You are aware of how exaggerated rumors can be. He proposed that this may be why Dan believes we had an affair. I interjected, Ray, I understand that you owe me nothing other than the fact that I saved your life. I continued, however, I will persuade Dan to speak with you. Will you tell him the truth about what happened between us and why I? Ray nodded slowly in agreement before departing. I informed him that I was happy to hand over the room to Betty, assuring him that he would heal just fine. As I descended in the elevator, I reflected on the merits of attending the meeting with Ari. I considered whether it was worth the effort. My current priorities were to save my marriage, to save my job, and finally, to consider Ree and his own marital and professional concerns. I contemplated the possibility of sacrificing Ree if it meant saving my marriage. I arrived at the office. After passing through security, I encountered Maxine Penn, an academy classmate with whom I had previously discussed her preference for an analytical position over fieldwork. This time, however, she avoided my gaze. Max, what is the matter? I inquired. I've been hearing disturbing things about you recently. I've been trying to warn you, she admitted, about the gym. It's not safe. She then departed hastily. What do you mean? I called after her. I'm not sure, she replied. Perhaps one of the men is looking for a casual encounter and calling Meg on the wall. Nevertheless, even if it were so implausible, I could not risk Dan seeing it and misinterpreting the circumstances. At that point, I felt sufficiently confident to inform Dan that, since our meeting, I had not engaged in sexual intercourse with anyone other than him. Therefore, his assumption that I had been unfaithful was erroneous. Despite his recent actions, particularly the note he had left for me, I was confident that he still loved me enough to forgive me. I was prepared to do whatever it took to win him back, even if it meant investing additional effort. Upon arriving at the gym, I opened the door and was immediately overcome with shock and pain. I felt as though I had been struck repeatedly in the abdomen and was struggling to catch my breath. My vision became blurred when I saw Kelly in my husband's arms. I overheard Dan discussing his marital status but quickly discerned from Kelly's remark that the situation might not last long. I shouted, "Get away from him, you horrible woman," and pulled her away from him, despite her rapid recovery. I was prepared for a violent confrontation with her. I was fortunate that I was not in possession of my service weapon. I felt as though I had nothing left to lose. Dan forcibly removed me from her presence, indicating that they might see each other later. I was enraged. I questioned my ability to participate in the electoral process. I mumbled with tight teeth. To my astonishment, she simply grinned and stated that she would email him her phone number. I began pursuing her down the corridor, intending to confront her in person. However, Dan intervened. I pleaded with him, "Dan, I love you. You are the only person with whom we can discuss this. We have nothing to discuss." He pushed my hair away and caressed my face with his hands. I cherished the moments when he did so, as it might ignite a spark within me. He apologized, stating that breaking old behaviors is challenging. However, he assured me that it would not happen again, yet I anticipated that it might. "Dan," I explained, "I have never engaged in sexual intercourse with any of them." He inquired if it was only I confirmed that it was, but that it was merely to relieve extra adrenaline throughout the task. I clarified that they had never done anything to me. We simply fulfilled each other in the most fundamental way. I acted in self-defense, recognizing the absurdity of the situation. "Meg, how did you respond when you entered the gym and saw me on the floor with Kelly?" he inquired. I felt remorseful. I was overcome with anger and a desire to inflict harm. I sincerely confessed. "Meg, we were fully clothed. It was merely sparring that escalated out of control, and there was no physical contact." He clarified, "Imagine your reaction if you walked in and saw what you used to do with your partners." I asserted that I would commit a criminal act. I inquired, in a deliberate and measured manner, as to whether such an act would be considered treasonous. He countered that this situation was not analogous to the others. I argued that while the underlying motivation might differ, the nature of the act and the emotional state involved would remain consistent. He reached a conclusion during our wedding ceremony, wherein he expressed our vow to remain faithful until death. He stated that for me, it was a solemn agreement. He proceeded to argue that regardless of the arguments presented, I had violated it. "Now that I understand your perspective, I can appreciate why you would have found this situation distressing." He stated that he found this acceptable, but I believe it is not an option for me. "I do not wish to be one of several men with whom you are having an affair." In response, he said that, for the sake of the 10 years we have spent together, he forgives me. He then asked if I was late for my appointment with Ari. I informed him that I had nearly forgotten and asked if we could resume our discussion later. He agreed and said that he would come to my house. I was relieved that Dan had forgiven me, as this was a crucial step in the process. He entered the office without announcing his presence. His gaze met mine, as if questioning my civility, but I was indifferent to his scrutiny. I requested that he proceed with the matter at hand. He gave me a peculiar expression and tilted his head. "I regret to inform you that after conducting a comprehensive investigation and speaking with several of your previous partners, I have a clear picture of what has been going on with you." He emphasized the importance of impeccable judgment and strong principles for his field operatives. He stated that it was not his concern who she associated with, whether for personal or professional reasons. He then proceeded to list the sanctions he had imposed on every agent who had worked with her in the previous year. He then turned to her husband's mental state, noting that he was also his agent. He continued, "You were unaware that Dan took a significant risk this morning, one that could have easily resulted in his demise. I hope he regains his sound judgment, but if he does not, I will have to reassign him to a desk job." He then added, "However, in your case, with the dearth of reliable field agents, largely due to your actions, I cannot afford to have a team member who. It has been determined that your actions jeopardize security, and thus, in the interest of national security, you are being terminated." Please empty your desk immediately. Security is waiting in your office to escort you out of the building. Do you have any objections? No, there are no grounds to reconsider. Goodbye. I responded cheerfully, almost, as I left his office, as though I were leaving a social gathering. A man attired in formal wear awaited my arrival. Are you Meg Almond? He inquired. Yes, I confirm, I replied. Have you been served? He demanded, handing me a substantial envelope. He then departed. I promptly opened the envelope and began perusing its contents. There must be some misunderstanding, I protested. Dan pardoned me, he replied. I vocalized my dismay as I hastened back down the steps, with the security personnel in tow. I proceeded to the cafeteria, where I observed Kelly approaching Dan. She took a seat at his table and smiled at him. Dan, I am sorry for my actions. Have you forgiven me? Yes, I have forgiven you. I demanded to know why my lawyer was serving me with divorce papers. I also questioned why my previous partners were being listed. I argued that this would only result in divorces for them. I added that it was not fair. I told him that if we were to reconcile, others should not suffer. I protested. I told him that we were not reconciling. I noted that Dan was becoming increasingly ignorant of Kelly smiling behind him. I told him that I forgave him, but that this did not undo what he had accomplished. I explained that forgiving does not imply that I or he could forget. I noted that without faith, our marriage had no foundation. I told him that we needed to move on with our lives. I suggested that perhaps once the sorrow had subsided, we could become. He proposed to me, a friend, and I rejected him. I am not merely his friend, my heart beats only for him. I recognize that I made a mistake, but losing everything is not fair. I am losing my job, my reputation, my marriage, my husband, and my lover. My best friend, Annie, suggested that he was a short agent, and Kelly might even be temporarily promoted to field agent. Then, she would take everything I am losing. She is already pursuing Dan. Our divorce papers have hardly dried, and she is already sinking her claws into him. I am not willing to accept this. I imagined that I would sink down, pretending to be on the verge of tears. I swiftly procured a sidearm from one of the security team's holsters as they retreated to ascertain my actions. I discharged 2 rounds, one striking Kelly's eye, splattering Dan with red fluids, while the other striking the top of my head. It is evident that we will have to resolve this matter in the afterlife. I contemplated falling to the ground. Thank you for taking the time to hear today's account. If you found this account agreeable, please indicate your approval by clicking the like button and subscribing to the channel. If you have a narrative to share about your own experience or that of another individual, please do not hesitate to contact me.